Fine. So, in order to prepare, as you can see, I am an international chef. I prepare special recipes necessary for parties that you're hosting. But my specialty is for recipes, not so much culinary as party planner recipes. How you can plan your Seder and your Shabbat and your Hanukkah. Those are the three books, the three how-to cookbooks, if you will, that I've produced, and how to do it in such a way as even if you're not the internationally famous French chef, you can still do it pretty easily. And that's what the Haggadot I have. And two of the things that Julie has sent you the link to is a PDF, both of my first Haggadah in English, A Different Night, the Family Participation Haggadah, and my more recent Haggadah I did with my son called A Night to Remember, with an emphasis on a Haggadah of contemporary voices. And I've also done one in Swedish, one in Brazilian, that is in Portuguese, one in Spanish for Latin Americans, and of course one in Hebrew. And for each community, there's a different emphasis because a Haggadah needs to offer ways in which people can customize it to their country, to their community, and of course, individually to their family, which is part of exactly what our topic is. In the previous session, we talked a lot about the Corona issues of the Seder. We're not going to talk about Corona issues today at all. In fact, it could be that the best response to Corona now that a year has passed is to forget about the Corona when it comes to the Seder and go back to normality. That's the usual Israeli response when there is, God forbid, a terrible terrorist attack. Within a day, if there's a restaurant that was blown up, it's already being reconstructed and people are back to normal life. And so although it's still not normal life, clearly for the Seder, we're going to deal with some of the issues that we have every Seder, whether it's Corona or not Corona. And the major goal is, and I think this is really my understanding of what the Haggadah is, and in general, how Judaism should be celebrated at home, it's a question of homemade Judaism. So I'm going to share with you one of the documents that we'll be looking at. Okay, I think that's big enough for you. It's toward a more participatory Seder. We're going to be using especially this Haggadah, A Night to Remember. And let me start with the first challenge, homemade Judaism. Home is where Jews are made. For such family events leave indelible memories. However, passively passing over traditions is not enough. Rather, in a very modern sense, a postmodern sense, meaning must be made, not preached or handed over. Meaning is made actively and collaboratively. In other words, today when we ask questions about our Judaism, we don't necessarily ask, what is it true or is it false? But we ask, is it meaningful to me, meaningful to my community, to my family, to those people I'm sharing with? And meaning is almost always the result of an active process by which we make things meaningful. And in making them meaningful, we make them relevant, we make them our own. The traditional ritual order, which is the original meaning of the word Seder, is only the external scaffold which we must adjust and fill with our own issues of freedom and identity. Each Seder must be customized to maximize participation by capitalizing on the hidden talents of the guests. The Seder must be personalized to make it relevant to each person in this moment. When asked what is being served at the Seder, the answer must be food for thought and experiences for creating family memories. Now, in order to allow you and to encourage you and to give you a sense of legitimacy in what's necessary to customize your Seder, there's also a certain amount of unlearning we have to do. It is not the case from my study of the history of the Haggadah and of the rabbis' creation of the Haggadah. It's not my experience or my knowledge that the most important thing in a traditional Haggadah is to read the whole Haggadah and not skip anything. That is not what the rabbis intended. Remember, the rabbis didn't even create a Haggadah. They created a list of ideas and laws and guidelines for how to do a Seder. The Haggadah only came in about 1,100 years ago, which is pretty recent in Jewish history. And since the Haggadah has been printed, and since most of us, in fact, all of us, are literate, at least in English, the Haggadah has turned into a reading fest, and that's a mistake. So let me start then, as we approach the Haggadah, to point out something about liberating the Seder from traditional misconceptions and returning to the rabbi's original educational vision, as David Hartman explained it, my teacher. The rabbinic Haggadah was meant to facilitate lively dialogue. Notice, the Haggadah is supposed to facilitate an activity. The activity is lively dialogue. Unfortunately, David Hartman, who grew up in a Haredi Hasidic family, unfortunately, Seder too often becomes rote reading to zoom through. That's in the old meaning of the word zoom. Rather than a drama of creative roles. Don't let the printed word paralyze the imagination. Talk, discuss. You are free to shape your own Seder. So let's get started by taking a look at how we would get our Seder running. And the first thing I would say is that a Seder has to begin with warm-ups. In the same way as you wouldn't begin to do a lot of physical labor or a physical workout without doing some loosening up exercises. The same is true in terms of trying to get people, especially if they're not even in the same room, or they're all in the same Zoom room, but not all in the same room. When they arrive, they have to get into it. You can't expect to go straight from hi, hello, time to start. That's why at the beginning of this session, I began by putting on that funny hat and talking personally. Just the putting on of that funny hat, that chef's hat, that was already a way of warming people up. Asking you the chat question about what your greatest obstacle, that was a way of warming up. And I'm recommending that you do some kind of a warm-up of the same way before your Seder actually begins, both for people on Zoom and for people who will actually be there physically. And I think there's a whole series of different things we can think about in the warm-up. The first one is to give some pre-Seder homework. Assignments for special recipes, especially a charoset taste test. One of the resources that Julie made available to you is a list of many, many international recipes for charoset. If you're having multiple people come, have them make different kinds of charoset and then taste them and compare and contrast and see what their content is. In the same way, one of the labor-intensive aspects of the Seder is the dips. So have different people make dips, their favorite dips. And find out the wine mevin who's coming to your Seder and ask him or her to pick out the best wines. And I don't mean sacramental sweet, but the best red wines they can possibly find, ideally Israeli ones, but any really good wine. And that's a way of getting people involved because they're all bringing food. Now, even if they're in different locations, they can still be making their favorite recipe, sharing that recipe with other people, even in advance, and then showing it. And then on the table in front of them, when they're participating in the Zoom Seder, will be their special recipe. Maybe take a nice photograph of that recipe when it's made and send it out to everybody. Further, another thing to do is to make it a personal Seder by asking people to bring that which is most important in their family traditions of Seder to the Seder table. So if you have a Kiddush cup, bring your wine cup. If you have a really nice pillow, then bring a pillow. If you're into tie-dyeing, make a special tie-dyed pillow for Pesach. If you have a Seder plate from the family, bring that Seder plate. The more Seder plates on the table, the better. You don't have to just have one. If you have your special candlesticks, bringing your own already brings you into the story in a very significant way. Beyond that, you can bring tools that you will need for dressing up and for activity. Pharaoh dress up. You can bring gifts to people. One of the mitzvot, one of the commandments before Pesach is to buy everybody in your family a special gift. You're supposed to do that for Rosh Hashanah and also for Pesach. So having nothing to do with the theme of the Exodus, if you get everybody a little gift at the Seder, perhaps play a game of what we call in Israel the Gamad ve'anak, the giant and the elf, you have everybody buying a little present which costs very little bit of money for each other. You can even assign who's responsible for whom, and then each one gets to open up that gift at the beginning, maybe to hide it under the matzah cover as well. And that, of course, cheers people up. If you want to know the Talmudic advice, the Talmud says, buy clothing for women. You can see their stereotypes. Colorful clothing if you come from Eretz Yisrael, and white linen if you come from Babylonia. For the children, you get them nuts and candies, and for the men, you buy them wine. But of course, everybody can find the right gifts that are appropriate for them. Second thing, have people share something personal at the beginning of their Seder through these warm-up questions. Perhaps your worst memory of a Seder, your best memory of the Seder, the strangest location you ever celebrated your Seder, perhaps in Kathmandu, perhaps as on a Peace Corps mission when you were younger and you went on the Peace Corps, perhaps it was a rainbow Seder, whatever it might have been. And that way, it's a way of, again, bringing together people's personal aspects. Beyond that, you can have your own family heirlooms, along with the Seder plate with its traditional items, each one being an edible symbol. You can create a second Seder plate, which has mementos of something important in your family's history. The passport of your grandparents or your great-grandparents, a photograph of you as a child at your family Seder, other important moments in the family history that will be a way in which you can share. And then as you pick up each one of them, just as you pick up the matzah and explain where it came from, you pick up the photograph and say where this photograph was from. Physically, especially if you're coming to the Seder in a physical way, then the physical setting should always already scream Pesach. My wife has already, for the last week, had all kinds of special signs up on the door that are related to Pesach that she pulls out every year. She took out her 10 bottles of toys and symbols representing the 10 plagues. She took out all of our nicest Haggadot and all kinds of games for the children to play. So you create the atmosphere in advance. Further, you can create placemats. Have the children or the teenagers create a special Pesach placemat for people, etc., etc., and put on some nice Pesach music as the background music, even when the Seder is beginning. And take a photograph of everybody who's at your Seder, or if they're all there physically, have them sign in to one of your Haggadot, put the date, and list everybody who was at the Seder that year, and you can revisit it every single year. Or some people will take a photograph of the Zoom, and therefore they'll have everybody who's on the Zoom Seder in the picture together, and then save it for a following year. It might be very poignant to begin by asking everybody the question, who is missing at your Seder? Who would you invite to this Seder if you could? Is it a great-grandfather? Is it an aunt who passed away as the result of Corona? Is it a famous historical figure, Martin Luther King or Moshe? Who is that person who's missing for you, and how can you bring them to the Seder? Could you even create a chair and pretend that they're there and introduce this most important person to you who's not here to the other members of the Seder and explain why that person is so important to you? But I would also add to that something very special, and that is, make sure to, when you light the candles and have everybody light candles, bless all the children and their relatives. I think last time I mentioned the notion of contacting your relatives, the ones who won't be at your Seder, and giving them your blessings as much as you can. But my last piece of advice for the warm-up is to follow a piece of advice from the Talmud, and that is to begin a class, and in this case, the Seder, with a joke, with something funny. You all know of those songs like to old American favorites that are transformed into Pesach songs. But let me particularly suggest to you Haggadah, the song at the very end of the Haggadah. In fact, we have a whole series of our best songs, our best traditional songs, Haggadah, Adirhu, Echad Mi Yodea, at the end of the Seder. But they're not supposed to be at the end of the Seder. They're simply located at the end of the Haggadah in an appendix, which is an appendix of nice songs to sing. They're not even directly connected to Pesach. But there's no reason to save those songs for the end of the Seder, especially as people already commented. Very often there isn't an end to the Seder. People don't come back after the meal. So I suggest take Haggadah, which is about the little goat, and immediately pass out to each person a different role in that. Let me show you a picture of that for a moment, and then we'll come back. Share screen. Okay. There we have it. Okay. So this is from the A Night to Remember Haggadah. You have a copy of this as well in your resources. And I'm going to look here for the song of Haggadah. Here it is. Haggadah, just one kid. This is an English version of it. Of course, there's the Aramaic original version. Just one kid that my Abba bought for 2 zuzim. Haggadah, one goat. Along came the cat, meow, and ate the kid, meh, that my Abba bought for 2 zuzim, Haggadah. What we do in our family at the beginning of the Seder very often is we hand out to each person a role. Who do you want to be? The cat, the dog, the water, the angel of death was my mother's favorite. Come up with some sort of a sound or maybe a gesture that represents the animal. And as you sing through the song, which is a round, then you have each person come in and do the sound. So it would begin like this. Along came the cat, meow, and ate the kid. Your turn. Who wants to say meh? And then for the dog, and then for the stick, and then for the water. And my mother's version of the angel of death was to take her hand like a knife and draw it across her throat. And it's a fun thing, and it's a good way to start your Seder. I'm going to stop sharing. We'll come back to this Haggadah later. We're going back again to some of the obstacles. And here is an example. You also have sent to you some various cartoons. So this is my favorite cartoon from the New Yorker about Pesach. Here we have the pyramids. The Jews are on their way out of Egypt, as you can see. And while everybody's leaving, poor Moshe is left in front of the oven waiting for the bread to rise. And he calls this, they call this cartoon, let me get you the title, Waiting for Godot. And of course, the pun on the famous play by Godot, where they're waiting for the author of the play to show up. So whatever sense of humor you have, this is your chance to do it. And remember delegating. You don't have to come up with the jokes. Pick somebody coming to your Seder who's good at it and ask them to come with a joke or 2 or 3 to open up the Seder. So that's enough about warm-ups. Let's talk about the question I asked you about 5 obstacles to a participatory Seder. The first one is the growling stomach. The second one is the Haggadah itself. The third one is preparations, too much work. The third obstacle, your own family. And the 5th obstacle, the anxieties of the perplexed Seder leader. Let's go through these briefly, and then we can walk through the Haggadah on our own. So the first thing is, the most frequently asked question at the Haggadah, at the Seder, is not manishtana, it's when do we eat? And the first and basic answer to remember is, there is no mitzvah to starve. Not by parsley alone shall we survive. Many of you can imagine and remember that when you come to a Seder, you're coming at 7 o'clock, at 8 o'clock at night, you sit at the table, perhaps you've just come from work, you're hungry, you can smell the aromas coming from the kitchen, you're sitting at a table with dishes and silverware, and immediately your stomach begins to produce the necessary juices for digesting food, and you find yourself saying, when do we eat? And then they come and they plap a book on your plate and they say, don't worry, we're going to be reading in this book for about an hour and a half, but don't worry, we're serving parsley soon. I don't know how much parsley you can eat. And if you are halachically strict, you might even say you can only have an olive's size worth of parsley. Not that that would solve the problem one way or another. But in fact, this is a total misunderstanding of the Seder. I could explain to you the halachic details, but I won't. I'll simply give you the historical response, and that is, in the earliest Haggadot that we found from around 1,000 years ago, we know that they used to serve after Kiddush, after the first wine, many, many hors d'oeuvres. In fact, the word karpas, sometimes translated as celery, in fact is a Greek word and it means veggies. And the key element here is, since the Seder is a kind of a symposium, it therefore begins as the Greeks and the Romans and the Jews of the Greco-Roman Empire began their Seders, and also all of their fancy meals with cocktails followed by hors d'oeuvres. And the hors d'oeuvres were always finger foods that involve dipping and appetizers. So in our family, for example, we have strawberries and chocolate fondue on a good Seder, guacamole, gefilte fish, hard-boiled eggs, potato chips and dip, artichokes, and many, many more things. If you want Julie to write into the chat, you can ask what people's favorite hors d'oeuvres are, and people will get ideas about what to bring to the Seder. You can even pass out trail mix, because it's a long trip, it's a long trail in the Exodus from Egypt until the end of the Haggadah, and I'll have something to nosh on. So that's our first thing. If you solve the problem of the food, then you don't really have to worry too much about the pressures people have. When you try to avoid serving too much food, then what happens is, of course, that people are not going to have time or mental space for all of the creative and interesting things, which are the main part of the Haggadah. The second obstacle is, as David Hartman wrote before, it's the Haggadah itself. Because the second most frequently asked question is, how fast can we get through the Haggadah as fast as possible? And especially on the second night, this question comes out and it becomes even more pressing. Why do we have to repeat everything we did last time in the same way? So I would say that the first step is to make sure that the Haggadah you have is not an archaic Haggadah. And we already had a mention of the Maxwell House Haggadah, which of course everybody has, or the Manischewitz, or the Margaretin, or whatever free version that they picked up. Back in 1923, did we talk about where the Maxwell House Haggadah came from, Julie, last time?
We did.
We did, okay. So the problem of the Maxwell House Haggadah, of course, is that it's translated into English, but the English is an impenetrable King James version English. At least that was true up until about 20 years ago. And therefore, it doesn't, in fact, make the Seder interesting at all. Even if you translate and you supposedly know what it's about, it's not very interesting, because the content of the traditional Haggadah is boring. It's not meant to be a book to read out loud. It's meant to be a checklist and a scaffold of activities that should be done at the Seder. The activities are interesting, but not the text of the Haggadah, for the most part, is not, which is why in the Haggadot that we produced, the more modern ones, we have many, many different possibilities to enrich those parts of the Seder as we go through. The third thing, as David Hartman said, is not which Haggadah you use, but how you use the Haggadah. If you make it a public recitation, then that becomes the greatest obstacle to the goals of the Seder. Very often I find that when people say, oh, a participatory Seder, that means that everybody gets to read. But if you go around reading, what often happens is what are they doing during the reading? So some of them are not interested. Maybe they're texting. Maybe they're noshing even on matzah if they can't find anything else to do it. Or maybe they're counting the next section to figure out which section they're going to be expected to read out loud. Because often the people reading out loud are exposing themselves to the desire of all the rest of the people at the Seder to correct all their English mistakes and their Hebrew mistakes. So the first principle is, do not allow anybody to correct a mistake when you're reading out loud. That's a misunderstanding. This is not a Torah reading where you need a gabbai sitting there to correct the Torah reader who has to read from a book that doesn't have vowels in it and doesn't have notes. No, you're reading from a book. If they make a mistake, what's the difference? Everybody's got the book in front of them. You want people to feel comfortable so that they really have a sense of me. Second, I never go around and ask people to read in order of where they're sitting. Instead, I will ask the person to read who in some way is connected to that theme. So if it's a part about the 4 children, then I may ask somebody who's a psychologist or a social worker or an educator to read that section. Always divide up the roles, not according to going around in a circle, but in such a way as people don't know what to expect, and that the person you ask them, you're giving them the honor because they're connected to the topic. Our goal will be, of course, to jump off of the Haggadah, using it as a scaffold or a jumping off point to get to the storytelling, to get to the dialogue between generations, to get to the discussions about freedom and slavery, and of course, the singing and the festivities. Notice it's not that I want to get rid of the traditional Haggadah and the traditional Seder. No, not at all. I love the Seder. But I want us to make sure that in maintaining the tradition, for the sake of our nostalgia and for the sake of the common thread, we also make room for variety each time we have the Seder. So the next issue, of course, is it takes so long to prepare for Pesach. Maybe this year, if you don't have a lot of people over, you'll find it doesn't take so much time. But usually it's too much work. And many people complain that they're dead tired by the time of the Seder. So there's simple answers to that question. So don't clean so much. Who said cleaning is so important? You can always say to cancel all of the chometz you might have in the house, all of the leavened bread that may be in crumbs. As soon as you cancel it in your head, which is the official ceremony you do the day before the Seder, then it doesn't exist. It's just dirt. So don't clean so much. Number 2, don't cook too much by yourself. I'm not opposed to cooking, but you can always order out, or better, you can delegate the culinary contributions and thus maximize participation and ownership. All right? C, prioritize the preparation of content over the Seder over the content of the menu. The very fact that you've taken an hour and a half today and an hour and a half last week, that's already very important, but you're going to need another hour and a half to go through the Seder and to make the decisions that you have to. So here I give you a free coupon. It's important to prepare the content of your Seder, more important than to clean your house and cook your meal. Take this coupon and decrease your cleaning by 1 hour and devote that hour to thinking about ways to involve the family. Now, let's talk about the family for a moment. People have already raised some of the issues. Sometimes the biggest possible obstacle to anything creative at a Seder is your family. The people who expect to be invited, whether they're interested or not. They'll be insulted if you don't invite them, but that doesn't mean when they're actually at your Seder that they're going to be a positive force for creativity. Very often their job is to remind you, who are you to tell us that you want to change the Seder? Are you better than our father, better than our mother? You're the rabbi of the family? Who are you to tell me, you're the younger sister, about how I should do a Seder? Of course, you're the one who's inviting them to the Seder. Or if you're a guest at the Seder, you can still say, I'm coming as a guest, and one part of the Seder I would like to contribute by making it more creative. And tell the host that in advance. Usually if you plan in advance, the host will accept it, and even announce to other people that you're the one who's going to be doing this special item. So what I often try to do is to delegate parts of the Seder in advance according to the talents and preferences of the strongest participants. In other words, if you as the Seder leader are the only person pushing for a meaningful Seder, then you're setting yourself in opposition to everybody else, and you're insisting that they submit to you. Sometimes they'll do it passively, sometimes passively aggressively, and sometimes actively aggressively. You need to find your coalition partners. Who else is into Seder? It's those people that you call up in advance, 2 or 3 people, and say, I want you to help me in the Seder. Here are some of my ideas. What are your ideas? Now let's delegate these responsibilities according to the strength of the people involved, right? And then literally I will print out a program listing all the people participating in the various parts of the Seder, sort of like a program, send it out in advance, and then everybody coming to your Seder knows that these people have prepared something special for the 4 questions, for the storytelling, for the Kiddush, whatever it might be. And nobody, I think, will want to insult people who are on the program and say, couldn't we just skip this and get to the meal? You can't do that when somebody's prepared something. Now, again, you don't have to pass it out to the person who's most creative or to the person who is most knowledgeable Jewishly. You just have to present it to anybody who has the initiative to say, let me try something. Those are your opinion makers. You don't need everybody's agreement. You need the opinion makers. And if you have 3 or 4 of them and they're on your side, you're in great shape. Now, some people are traditionalists in a good sense, and they're worried that you're going to change things and it won't be like the Seder they know. So those people, come to them and say, look, I know you love the traditional Seder. What part of the Seder do you like the most? And they'll say the Kiddush or something like that. And you say, wonderful, I'm going to ask you to do the Kiddush, to say the blessing over the wine. They have their place. They can feel secure in that place. Now, one of my favorite ideas is to find the hidden talents of the people at your Seder, not necessarily their Jewish talents. So I don't think I told you this story last time, but if I did, stop me. Did I tell you about the rabbi from Hollywood? Okay. A friend of mine, Haskell Bernat, who's a retired rabbi, recalls his first Passover at the prominent Temple Israel of Hollywood. He was expected to conduct a public Seder at the synagogue, just as had his predecessor, who put on a show and invited eminent Los Angeles personalities. Bernat, however, believed in intimate family Seders at home. He agreed reluctantly to lead the public Seder, but declined to prepare a dramatic program. He hoped the public Seder would be a failure, and then he could emphasize from then on the importance of each member of the congregation preparing their own family Seder. Bernat was about to start with an expected 300 attendees when in walked unexpected guests. Bob Dylan, that's Bob Dylan, who is really Bob Zimmerman from Minnesota, along with 2 well-known non-Jews, a First Natives chief and Marlon Brando. In panic mode, the rabbi asked the president of the congregation, are we built on an American Indian burial plot? Thinking on his feet, Bernat thought of creative ways to involve his surprise guests. He asked Marlon Brando with his deep voice to do a dramatic reading in English of the Kiddush, while the rabbi explained that Passover about the liberation of all nations in order to make it relevant to the chief. Later, he asked his cantor to bring her guitar and then invited Bob Dylan to sing Blowing in the Wind with its appropriate Passover lyrics. Yes, how many years can people exist before they're allowed to be free? Next year, 500 people showed up for the public Seder. So you have those hidden talents as well. You could probably already tell me who at your Seder is a psychologist, who's into politics, who reads the New York Times every day, who are the people, who's the best storyteller, who is the best artist, and to give them jobs according to those skills. Somebody to do their artistic version of the 4 children, somebody to help the kids to dress up as if they're coming out of Egypt together. But one important principle, actually 2 principles. Number 1, don't worry too much about rocking the boat, but innovate. There are some people who think the most important thing of the Seder is to make everybody feel comfortable, and therefore the lowest common denominator with the least changes and the shortest Seder is most likely to please everybody. My answer to that is not on Pesach. On Thanksgiving, it can be a family get-together. The main thing is for everybody to eat and enjoy themselves together. But Pesach is about making a meaningful Jewish event for yourself, your children, and your grandchildren. You can't compromise on that for the sake of getting along with everybody. And so as long as you let people know in advance what's going to happen, they're going to have to fit some way. Nevertheless, I warn you, make sure to change something every year, but beware, never change more than 10% in 1 year, or you're going to be thrown out of the family. Change is the greatest threat to any family system. So if you come from Northern California, you can change 20%. If you come from England, 2%. And on an average, I would say 10%. And it's those changes which really become very memorable. And the last of the obstacles, the last one we'll mention before we start looking through the Haggadah itself, is the anxieties of the perplexed Seder leader. Don't worry about getting it wrong. Just worry about deciding in advance what's most important to you. You can't satisfy everybody, but you can be inclusive. So almost everyone finds something they do like. Don't worry about controlling everything, but conduct a jazz-style Seder. Maximize participation so people make their own meaning. Don't worry about getting it wrong. Learn and experiment. Then try again in different ways the next year. Tell people, I'm going to try some new things. Don't worry, this is not going to be the way it is for all the Seders from here in. It's an experiment, and we'll experiment next year and see what we want to do then. Let me stop sharing and ask if you have any questions at this point.
Alrighty, if there are questions, you can either put those in the chat box or you can ask to be unmuted and ask your question. Everyone's saying this is amazing info and thank you, and it's so creative. Are there good recordings of the songs that you know of?
That varies from community to community, Reform, conservative, whatever it may be. And so you just have to check it out either with a rabbi or even better, a cantor, or just try on internet until you find one that has the songs that you already know yourself. That's really the key element. And by the way, I forgot, but when we do in our family the Haggadah, we have stuffed animals for each one of the characters. And again, that always helps. And then you can find the expert in your family who has the most stuffed animals to bring them for Haggadah.
Someone asked how, if they want to do everything but know that they cannot do everything, at least not this year, how would you suggest they go about choosing what to do?
Well, there's two things. We're gonna now walk through the Haggadah and point out the things that I think are interesting and important. Second of all, I sent one of the documents you have is walking through the Haggadah, which talks about 6 important stops on the Haggadah. And then I think we included also the Seder planner for the A Different Night Haggadah and the Seder planner for the Night to Remember Haggadah, which already allow you to pick and choose what you think is most important. Start from what your family has always liked the most in your traditional Seder. If you're more halachic, then you can, of course, consult with your rabbi. But the truth is that many parts of the Haggadah are not required. And you can save a lot of time on not doing those not required sections. So the ones you do, you can do it more expansively, inclusively, and in an interesting way. Plus, remember, as long as you have the hors d'oeuvres on the table, people are not going to say, hurry up, when do we eat? And the truth is, the wonderful thing about Zoom, if you have somebody participating in Zoom who's very bothersome and negative, you can always mute them. That's a wonderful power. I hope we can have that even after Corona is over.
I think that probably answers how do you deal with the critic and constant interrupter.
Right.
How do you suggest explaining some of the traditions to non-Jewish guests while not boring some of the old timers?
I think the key element here would be to make sure that for 2 things. One is use the non-Jews questions as a source of making it interesting for everybody. If you see there's establish that the non-Jew would be sitting next to somebody and that the non-Jew can ask that person questions and get an answer on the side. But especially ask that whenever there's a good question, to throw the question out to the whole group. So instead of you being the person who has to explain it, or even if you're the most knowledgeable, you explaining it, instead throw out the question, great question that he asked about the 4 questions. Why are there 4 questions? Who'd like to throw out answers? Whatever answers we get are fine. And then people can participate like in a warm-up chat question and throw in their ideas. And then it won't be boring to people because they're not doing it by rote. They're answering a real person, asking a real question, and who they would anyway probably like to impress. Right? Since he's the outsider in the family, we usually want to host them. And then the old timers are very honored that somebody's interested in their old traditions.
So I just want to point out that someone suggested Paul Zim's Seder nights for traditional Passover songs. Right. And someone asked, do you have specific tips for first timers?
Well, is it the first time you're leading a Seder with all kinds of people who have traditional Seder backgrounds? Or is it the first time you're doing a Seder and you're doing it with other first-time people? There's a very big difference between the two. With other people, you have to make sure that you're hitting the highlights that they like, and that's the delegating and the consulting and creating a coalition with people who have more experience. But if it's a first-time Seder and you're doing it with other people who are very uncertain about it, then the key element is to pick the most important things. We're going to talk about those most important things now, and then just stick to those and do them in a rich and interesting way. You always want to end with a sense that people want more. That's what I would say is important. And it's an experiment the first time. And you announce, this is my first time. I'm going to be experimenting. We'll learn from the experience. We're going to try again the next night, and we're going to try again next year. So let's experiment. You don't have to produce a performance that everybody sits back and says, what an amazing performance. You have to involve them, and then they'll feel, wow, we really got together and came up with something interesting. Okay? How about if we stop?
I think we can turn to the Haggadah now.
Okay, fine. So this is the night to remember Haggadah. And let me introduce you to, and of course it's a tradition to read the whole Haggadah before Pesach itself to get into it. And so this will sort of fill in for part of that role. You know what? Let me see if I have it. No, it doesn't have it. I have to look in the cover later. Okay, so the first thing is, and this is what I do at the beginning of my Seder, welcome to our Seder. Tonight is a night to remember. Tonight is the Jewish people's birthday. Yes, according to the Torah, this month, the month of Aviv, the month of Nisan, is the birthday month of the Jewish people. It's the rebirth of personal freedom for each individual. Tonight is a journey of rediscovery, to relive slavery and poverty, and then to experience liberation and taste abundance. We'll be eating together, reading, discussing, and arguing, asking questions, playing and acting, praying, singing. Join in. Some sort of an opener like that in order for people to feel comfortable about being at the Seder. Now let's look for a moment at the structure of the Seder. If you know the structure, then you can pick and choose more intelligently. The basic structure of the rabbinic Seder is 4 cups of wine. Each cup of wine goes along with a different main activity. The first one is Kiddush. It sanctifies the night, and it's followed by hors d'oeuvres while reclining. That we've talked about. The second part is called the Magid. It's the storytelling cup of wine. We pour the cup of wine at the beginning, but we drink it only at the end of each section. And here you can see Magid is the longest part of the Seder, with probably the most famous and most important elements. The first one being Halach Ma'anya, the story of the matzah. The Manishtana, the questions. We were slaves, the story. And then you can skip the 5 rabbis, that's not important. You can do the 4 children if you like that, but you don't have to do it. And then you have a second version of the story. Besides the story that says we were slaves to Pharaoh, we have the story our ancestors were slaves to idolatry. So the first story is about political and economic freedom. And the second one is about spiritual and psychological freedom. And then there is the section of the symposium, the philosophical discussion about freedom and slavery, ending with the 10 plagues. The song Dayenu that we talked about last time is a chance to say, what are the things during the Corona period that I'm happy with and I'm pleased with, and I'm really thankful to God that I had them. Then you explain Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, the 3 edible symbols of the holiday, the bitter herbs, the matzah. And then you talk about the most important principle of the Seder, bechol dor vador. Each of us is obligated to feel as if they went out of Egypt. So if you ask what a Seder is for, it is not about conveying information about ancient history. It's about experiencing through empathy what it means to be a slave, what it feels like to go free, as hopefully you will in the next few months go free from your homes as the vaccinations begin to make America a safer place, which has already begun to happen in Israel. And we're going to have our Seder with the whole family outside in the garden of my son, not very far from here, because all the family members over the age of 16 have been vaccinated. Then there's the part of the Seder which is Hallel, which is singing praise to God. And now we have the second cup. The second cup is simply the cup of wine at the end of the meal, in which, so in the meal itself, of course, you eat the matzah, you eat the maror, you make a special sandwich with charoset as a kind of a mix inside of it. You eat at the end of the meal, you have that last piece of matzah, the afikoman, which signals the end of all the eating. And then there's Birkat HaMazon, thanking God. You want to save some time? Do Birkat HaMazon as just one paragraph, or just say one word of thanks and then be done with it. And then it ends with the third cup. The fourth cup is the Hallel. And that cup ends with singing, with Kos Eliyahu, when we fill the cup for Elijah and open the door. And then there is the fourth cup. And then at the end of the Haggadah, as I said, are the poems and folk songs, which I don't think you should wait until the end of the Seder to do. Do them earlier as a kind of a punctuation for fun. And then the very last part of the Seder is as the Seder turns from memories of slavery and persecution to hopes for the future. This part of the Seder, as we talked about last time, is super important for this year. If you're having a hard time getting people to come back after the meal, tell them we have to come back for the end of the meal, at the very least for us to open the door for Elijah and for us to express our hopes for the future. And that's basically the structure. So let's start with, yes, please.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes.
Would you be able to go into full screen mode? So on the top left, there's the view, and there should be a full screen mode option.
Where should that be? Under viewing?
Yeah.
I'm looking.
Page
full screen mode. Yes.
Enter full screen mode. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks for teaching me that. Okay. Okay. So here's Kiddush, where we sanctify the time. The hand washing, the karpas, which is the hors d'oeuvres, lots of different hors d'oeuvres. And now let's look at the very beginning. The structure of the Seder, for anybody doing a Seder, is to begin with suffering, with poverty, with sadness, and then going through the process, including the 10 plagues, that ultimately leads us to our liberation, to redemption, to our hope for future continuation of the redemption. And therefore, it's important to start with an experience of poverty. The rabbis always understood that it's not only about slavery, it's also about poverty. Certainly a problem we have in our society that Corona has made much more exacerbated. And so the very thing is to take a big piece of matzah. That's what my son suggests. Give everybody at your Seder a whole matzah. Have them go around either silently to themselves or share what in their lives or in the society they live is broken. To think about that moment of brokenness and then to slowly break the matzah. There's this wonderful cracking sound as each person breaks the matzah. The second half of the matzah is what's going to be held for the last thing you eat on Seder night, which is the afikoman, that second piece of matzah. And in that sense, the Seder is one complete circle. And you go from the broken to the completion at the end and the hopes for further redemption. You can see the way this Haggadah is structured. There's always directions and ideas and customs on one side. There are various activities and explanations here. Here's a reference to Leonard Cohen's poem. There's a crack in it. There's a crack in everything. That's where the light comes in. We have that whole poem later on in the Haggadah, and you could use that as an opener, especially during the year of Corona, to talk about what's broken in our families and in our society. Then various ways to talk about poverty. This is a children's book that I love to do with the Seder. I go around, each person says, being poor is having your heat shut off in the winter because your parents can't pay the bill. Being poor is having 2 blankets for 7 people in the family, and go around and have everybody contribute something that expresses what poverty is about. And if anybody has been in that situation who's willing to share with you, then to talk about how they felt when they were economically deprived one way or another. All right. Okay. Beautiful poem by Marge Piercy about the Magid, about the storytelling. And then we have the next important part of the Seder is Halachma, the story of the matzah. And in this one page, we basically have the whole Haggadah in one page. Something about the past, something about the present, something about the future. We begin with the past. This is the bread of poverty and persecution that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Notice the matzah here is not the matzah that the Jews ate when they were escaping from Egypt because their bread didn't have time to rise. That's the matzah of liberation. But this matzah is the matzah of poverty. It's the simplest possible bread. It's unenriched bread. Now, on Passover, you can have chocolate-covered matzah, and you can have egg matzah, and onion matzah, and everything you want, and whole wheat matzah, but not at the Seder. The Seder is flour and water. That's all. Matzah at its poorest, because the idea is that's what the Jews ate. In fact, one commentator, Abarbanel, suggests that matzah is the first fast food, with my excuses to McDonald's or Wendy's. It was the fast food that you're only allowed to take up to 18 minutes to prepare it. And the idea is that if you're a slave owner, or perhaps if you own Walmart, you don't want people to take long breaks which keep them from doing their work. And so then you encourage them to eat only matzah that can be paired very quickly. And anybody knows, once you've had some matzah, it stays in your stomach for a long time, and it will keep you from having to go back and eat, and therefore to take more time. After talking about the past with the matzah, the breaking of the matzah, and by the way, the reason we break the matzah as a piece is because we want to imitate poor people. When a poor person or a person on a very limited budget, depending on monthly Social Security checks, then they're not going to eat a whole loaf of bread at one sitting because they don't know where they're going to get their next loaf of bread. They're going to be saving. And so the poor person breaks the matzah and eats only a part of it. On Shabbat, when we're celebrating abundance, then we normally have 2 full chalot, which are unbroken. But on Passover, one of the matzahs has to be the broken one, remembering poverty and enslavement. After getting in touch with the past, it's not just about history, it's about experiencing the past. Then immediately it has implications for the present. You look around and you say, let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come and share the Pesach meal. Now, I would suggest that means that if you haven't yet made a contribution to people who are starving or hungry or who can't afford putting a Seder together this year, then that's something you definitely need to do. I think it's immoral and to celebrate a big fancy Passover meal when we haven't worried about the hungry people. Now, ideally, we should be able to invite people to our Seder who are lacking in food. That doesn't usually happen in an American or even in an Israeli Seder. So at the very least, we have to make sure that we've sought out organizations that worry about those people and made a contribution to them. And then at the beginning of your Seder, or at Halachmanya, ask everybody at the Seder to report to whom did they give their tzedakah to support the hungry? What organization? Why did they pick that organization? But it's not only about helping hungry people, it's also let all who are in need come and share the Pesach meal. Not just share food, but join us for the Seder. Have you thought about inviting a distant cousin or a student or somebody who doesn't have another place to have a Seder? And that way you're allowing them, as somebody wrote, loneliness is one of the big obstacles to their Seder, to gather in a few of those lonely people and make them full participants in your Seder is exactly what we need to do. So Pesach moves from memory of the past to responsibility for the present and solidarity. And then it looks forward at the end of the Seder. This year, we're still here in a lockdown of Corona. Next year in the land of Israel. This year, we're still enslaved. Next year, maybe free people. And then this Haggadah has all kinds of extra ideas about how to talk about that openness to helping people. And here, one of the activities I suggest is go around the table and ask people to talk about volunteer work or acts of hospitality that they've either participated in or seen, and explain what they saw. And I think that's a very inspiring, you get to know about your people at your Seder in a totally different angle, about things they have done to help one another and to help people in their society. That's wonderful. That really makes the Seder a real thing, not just a ritual and not just ancient history. Here is a wonderful explanation of what I just told you about the needy but not the poor from Rabbi Soloveitchik. Right? Pesach is a time for sharing, a time of solidarity, responsibility, unity, and readiness to share and to participate are not manifest and demonstrated. The whole Seder becomes meaningless. Okay. Here is a wonderful story about a synagogue in Toronto, the Holy Blossom Synagogue, a giant synagogue that decided to join a group of churches in the coldest months of the Toronto winter and to turn the synagogue into a place for hospitality for the homeless. And what they meant by hospitality is they would bring pianos, they would play music, they would bring games like Monopoly and Canasta and Bridge, and they would sit and they would welcome these people as their guests, treat them as guests, play games with them, and get to know them as people. So any other examples of helping the people who are needy, this is the time to bring it into your Seder. Here we have a Primo Levi poem, a folk tale. There are multiple ways that we can get to this. Now take a look at Manishtana. Okay? So Manishtana, what have we done? We did the Halach Ma'anya. We do now Manishtana. We have to begin the Seder with questions. The basic principle of the rabbis in the Mishnah is that before you tell stories, before you try to pass over to the next generation the knowledge and the experience that you have, you first have to make sure that they're interested. And how do you do that? You do it by doing strange customs. The stranger the behaviors you do, the more likely people, for example, non-Jews, are like, say, but why did you do this? And any little change in your Seder will immediately get the veterans to say, wait a minute, we didn't do that last year. Like starting with Haggadah, they're going to say, why is this Seder different than all other Seders? So the very fact that the Seder has a Seder, it has an order to it, allows us, according to Maimonides, to put in a little disorder into the order and therefore to evoke people's interests. So what Maimonides used to do is he would pass out candy and nuts to the children at the table before Manishtana. And the kids would say, wait a minute, that's dessert. How could you give us dessert before we eat? Parents never do that. And that was his idea. He had a second idea that you also probably do at your Seder. His idea was to take the matzah and to treat it as a matzah frisbee and to grab it and to hide it and to throw it around. Maimonides was taking the matzah, which is an essential part of the mitzvah of this evening, the commandment, and yet saying, let the children play with that matzah, and that's how you keep their interest and how you get them to ask questions. Right? And then he had another idea, which was to stop the Seder at this point, pick up the Seder plate and take it into the kitchen as if the Seder is all over and we're done eating, even though we haven't eaten. All of these are ideas in the Talmud, that Maimonides tried to bring. Let me show you a story about that. Okay, there's a story about a world famous professor of for learning disabilities and for the culturally deprived, called Professor Reuven Feuerstein, who came up with this special method. And he was a Swiss Jew, he's always wearing his beret, and he would invite some of the children from disadvantaged homes to come to his Seder. And he would always warn them. He would say, listen, this Seder is very serious. We have a lot of words to get through. If anybody asks any questions, I'll be forced to throw candy at you. The kids immediately understood the idea, and they started to ask lots of questions and get lots of candy. You can even give the candy to some teenager and have the teenager throw candy at any adult or child who asks a question, as long as the question is not, when do we eat, or when will this Seder be over? Now, this idea of asking questions is not just a good technique. It has to do with the very essence of what the rabbis wanted from people. They wanted them not to know answers, but to know how to ask questions. So one of my favorite stories, which is in the A Different Night Haggadah, is about Professor Isidore Rabi from my university, from Columbia, who is a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And when he passed away, there was an article in the obituary in the New York Times, and they reported that they had interviewed him. And they asked him, why is it that you, from the Lower East Side, along with all those other Jewish kids, you became a physicist and won a Nobel Prize? And they became lawyers and doctors and businessmen. And he said, oh, I'm a great physicist, if I am such a thing, only because of my mother. When children would come home from school, perhaps that still happens today, the parents would say, what did you learn today in school? And the standard child's answer would be, nothing. Stop bothering me. But Isidore Rabi's mother asked the question, what good questions did you ask in school today? And Isidore Rabi says, that's what turned me into a scientist with curiosity, the ability to formulate my own questions. Now, a fun thing to do with the questions is a friend of mine, Eliezer Siegel, who's a Jewish studies expert from Calgary, I believe it is, who wrote his own version of Dr. Seuss's 4 questions for the Uncle Ellie's Haggadah. It's a wonderful thing to read together, and everybody does the stanza. Yes, on all other nights we eat all kinds of bread, but tonight of all nights we munch matzah instead. But on Passover night you would never consider eating an herb that wasn't all bitter. And it's a wonderful and fun thing to do. And here are some deeper, meaningful things about asking questions of various kinds. I would say that the asking of questions is the essence of what human freedom is about. When you're a slave, then nobody has to explain or justify anything they say. But when you're free, you have a right to ask, well, why is it this way and not some other way? So the most important story in that field that I know, and it's in the materials that I sent you, but not in the Haggadah, is a story from the Primo Levi, who was a chemist who was sent to Auschwitz during the war from Italy. And in 1944, in the winter, just before the liberation of Auschwitz, which was in January 27th, 1945, he looked out of his, not really a cabin, but sort of the bunk he was in, and looked through the window, which of course didn't have glass, and there was an icicle. And he said to himself, when was the last time I had ice cream? When did I get something cold like that in my mouth? So he stuck his hand out and broke off the icicle in order to bring it so he could suck it. Just as he did that, one of the Nazis came by, saw the icicle, smashed it out of his hand, just for pure sadism. Of course, there were no rules in the camp that said you're not allowed to have an icicle. And then Primo Levi turned to this man, so shocked, and he said in German, Warum? Why? And the Nazi answered him a very appropriate answer. Hier ist kein Warum. You're in this camp. This is not a place where anybody has the right to ask why. Why assumes that you're a dignified human being. Why assumes that there's a reason for things. But you're living as a non-human being in an arbitrary realm. There's no freedom there. And so here is a good chance for people to talk about what freedom is from these questions. By the way, if you're into Kahoot, if you know what it is, you can always have the teenagers prepare a Kahoot of questions about the Seder. In fact, my daughter just sent a whole series of 20 questions, which she prepared with her kids. Her 8-year-old is going to be asking these questions at the Seder. So in preparation, we're going to be helping him get the answers before the Seder. Of course, you can have people ask Manishtana in multiple languages. Here you have some of those languages. And then once you've got people interested, the next essential part of the Seder is to tell the story. And the main story is the story about our political and economic and ethnic persecution in Egypt. And it's very simple. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Adonai freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Now there's one problem about the Haggadah. The whole point of the Haggadah is to tell the story. But in the traditional Haggadah, the story of the Exodus is not there at all. You only have that one sentence, we were slaves, God freed us. That's not a story. That doesn't leave an impression. But in the Haggadah, which, as I said, is a how-to book, a leader's guide, it tells the leader of the Seder what to do at this point. The Chol HaMarbeh L'Saper. So the more and the longer one expands and embellishes the story, the more commendable it is. They're telling you, you know what? Tell the story. And then they bring the story of the 5 rabbis who all night long went on telling the story, asking questions. Now, you don't have to read about the 5 rabbis. And you don't have to read this sentence at the Seder, even though it's in the Haggadah. You have to do it, not read it. But what do most people do? They say, well, I don't have time. People are hungry. I don't know what to say. Turn to the next page. In other words, people who read every single word of the Haggadah have not lived up to the minimum commandment of telling the story. Now, everybody knows the story one way or another. You've all seen The Prince of Egypt. Maybe you've seen the 10 Commandments, depending on how old you are. You've maybe in the synagogue, we read the story from Exodus. And yet, what our job to do is not to convey the historical information, it's to tell the story in a dramatic way to our children, to our grandchildren, in a powerful way, empathizing. So in this Haggadah, we offer all kinds of ideas to help people tell the story. So one way is to provide pictures and then to use them as triggers and to go around, okay, see this picture? Somebody, could you please tell me the story in first person? Oh, yes, I was a slave, and there was this really fat Egyptian who was whipping us, and we really had to schlep these enormously heavy stones, and going up the hill, stop, next person, tell me the story, tell me the story, tell me the story. Have your children and grandchildren do pictures of the story of the Exodus, read them the story, have them do a picture, and hang up those pictures on a clothesline in order of the historical events, and then have the child or you tell the story using the child's own pictures, right? Or we have a newspaper version of the Haggadah we put in the Haggadah. This is the Hieroglyph Times, all the news that's permitted to print. It's a story about the Exodus. There's some advertisements here, situation wanted, speech therapist available afternoons and evenings. I got Moses to say, let my people go. I can get you to speak up too. Nefertiti, therapist to the stars, etc., etc. There's both a humorous part, and of course you can have people do their own version of it. And there's many, many, many more ideas for telling the story. So what have we done? What do we say? We have to do halach ma'anya after Kiddush. We have to do asking of questions of all different kinds. Perhaps have everybody coming to the Seder write out a question they have and put it into a box, right? And then have the kids pull out one of the questions and open the question up, say, who has an answer to that question? And then storytelling. It's at this point that, again, we will need props. So on Purim in Israel, when there's all kinds of costumes, we purchased this Pharaoh's crown. It even has a little bit of the symbol of ancient Pharaoh, which is the cobra up here. And if you collect a whole bunch of things and then you send out a parent or somebody who's good at acting with a paper bag dramatics, get all the kids dressed up and have them marching into the Seder at this point. And then you tell them, where are you coming from? What was it like in Egypt? How was your trip through the desert? The acting out is essential because the goal is to identify as if I went out of Egypt. Therefore, actors or anybody with dramatic skills, that's the person to have them do the storytelling in your Seder. Here's the story of the 5 rabbis. Skip it. You don't have to do it. What we do in our family is we'll ask people to say about the most unusual Seder they were in. So here we give you examples. A Seder of an Israeli pilot who was in a Syrian prison for Passover. The story of the last Ethiopian Seder in 1991 before the big aliyah of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. Here is Golda Meir participating in a hunger strike Seder in 1946 to get the British to open the borders of Israel to refugees. Here's a Seder in 2002 in Los Angeles in which the children got together and raised money to buy the freedom of Christians who had been enslaved by Muslims in Sudan. That's, of course, South Sudan today. And then there's the section of the 4 children, which of course is a wonderful section. This is basically, what's it doing in the Haggadah? It's a typology. It's designed to help the parent know that he has to tell the story in a different way for each different person at the Seder. If it's a 5-year-old, if it's a 20-year-old, if it's somebody first Seder, if it's somebody who's not Jewish, if it's somebody who converted, if it's somebody who doesn't want to be there. So it begins by creating a typology. Now, the truth, of course, is that no one person is the wise one or the rebellious, but everybody has all those elements in them. What we did here is we put in different pictures done by multiple artists who conceived each one of the wise child and the wicked child in a different way. So this is an Israeli one where the wise child is sitting on, he's a nerd. He's sitting on a pile of books which say in 7 different words for why in Hebrew. He's sitting with a laptop on him, and the laptop says intelligent. That is, the ideal Jew in Israel today in some ways is the high-tech geek who invents another company, a high-tech company, and sells it to Intel, and that becomes the model who is the wise child. And of course, there's different representations. Here, our artist gave us, an Israeli, his version of 4 different kinds of women in America. So he imagines the wise child is the Reform rabbi dressed in a suit with her briefcase with a very big book that can only be a Talmud. And she even has payas. She even has side locks, if you will. So she's the wise one. And then you have the rebel, not necessarily a wicked child, but a rebellious one, who's into protests of all different kinds. Or if you want a simple child, here is Madonna, or a Madonna figure, Kabbalah with Madonna, who is levitating. And the child who doesn't ask any questions, who's clueless, is the child who's so into listening to music that they don't hear anything at all. And there are many different ideas. For example, you can have a discussion about, do you like the word wicked for any child? If not, what word would you use? Because we need a title or a category for understanding people who are alienated in some way from Judaism or from the Seder or from the family. And then you could ask a therapist, what are various approaches to deal with people who are alienated? And I'm sure every family has the person who's distanced himself at one stage of his life or other. There's a lot of other ones, and I'll simply end with one of my favorites. This is a Haggadah by Dan Reisinger, who is an Israeli, who is an expert at logos. He did the logo for El Al, the logo for the Israeli Philharmonic. And when he was asked to do a Haggadah, he decided to paper cuts. So if you were to look at this 4 and you were to ask the Seder question, which is, tell me, who is the wicked child? Could anybody here answer that question? I'd like to suggest that it's impossible to answer that question, because even though each one of these figures is different, they're not all the same, they each have in them different elements, different colors. They have all four colors, all four shapes, and the borders between them are not sharp lines, but they're torn paper to show that the borders are different. Each one of us is a mixture that has all those elements in us in one way or another. And here the quotation is from Yisrael Salanter from the 19th century. We each have all the four children within us. You might want to go around your Seder and say, I'd like everybody to tell me, when do they feel like the child who's the rebellious one? Or when do they feel totally clueless and out of things? When it comes to computers, I'm the one who doesn't know how to ask questions. Even Julie has to explain to me how to go to full sharing, right? And on other topics, I'm not. So again, and of course, there are multiple kinds of intelligence, not just one kind of intelligence. Okay. Now, I told you that there's two different stories of the Passover. There's the Passover about political freedom. We were slaves and now we're free. But there's also spiritual liberation. And that's what the function of this page is in the Seder. It's in the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshipers. The Hebrew word for that is slaves to idol worship. But now God has brought us near to serve Adonai. So here is where we do in our Seder something which is about spiritual liberation. So for example, this is a time when if we have somebody at the Seder who wasn't very involved in Judaism before and who's now involved in Judaism, or wasn't a Jew and converted to Judaism, we ask them, could you tell us the story of how you chose to be Jewish or chose to be more Jewish in your life? What were you doing? What was important to you? This is the part about Jews by choice. Right? Or our artists did various versions of things that we are servants to. Sometimes my children, my grandchildren always say that I am a slave to the computer. I'm always answering emails, even when I should be playing with the grandchildren. For some people, it's smoking. For other people, it's always worried about diets. Of course, we know that on Pesach, none of the food is allowed to have calories. You're not allowed to count calories. For some people, it's the cell phone. When it rings, they cannot, no matter what they're doing, they have to break in the middle to answer the cell phone, even if there's people right in front of their face. So you can talk about the various ways that we are enslaved, and both how our parents behaved and how we have changed the ways of our parents. That's a great question to ask. What aspects of your upbringing did you have that you've decided you wanted to change in your life? That also gives permission to the children there to talk about how they want to change things that they don't like in their upbringing. Because Pesach is about continuity, but it's also about rebellion within the structure. Okay. Here's the part about V'hi she'amda. This is the part that God promised us that whenever there are threats to our lives, whether it's Corona or whether it's Iran, that we still have the hope and the dream that God will stand up and help us to meet those threats. V'hi she'amda. This promise has stood us and our parents in good stead. For not only has one enemy stood over us to annihilate us, but in every generation's enemies have stood over us to annihilate us. Yet the Holy One keeps the promise to save us from their hands. This is one of the best drawings in the new Haggadah. The artist did a picture of some of the representatives of all those who have persecuted the Jews, the Pope, the Crusaders, the Nazis, the Soviets, the Spanish Inquisition, all of them running after the Jews, and that sense of how many enemies. And here we put together an abbreviated list of the persecutions the Jews went through all the way up until 1942, the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, when the Nazis decided on the final solution. But I'm sure you could add more examples of that as well. And now comes the symposium. At some time in the Seder, you need to have a discussion about freedom and slavery. The traditional way of doing it is reading these verses, this one page, and then beginning to have a discussion. In the traditional Haggadah, they have put multiple examples of midrashim, of rabbinic interpretations. There is no obligation to read these ancient rabbinic midrashim. Instead, the mitzvah is to come up with your own. So what we did in our Haggadah is to give many examples of conversations you could have. Here, this is about the Ethiopian Jewish community coming to Israel. This is about assimilation and identity, about birth and genocide, because of course Pharaoh was planning to began to kill all of the boys, throwing them into the Nile. By the way, the same thing happened in South Sudan with Christian tribes, where I was told by an Anglican minister who teaches there every year that she read the story of the Exodus about throwing the Hebrew babies into the water. And then the women say, yes, that's what happened to us. When the Muslim marauders came, and we were working in the fields at the river, and we had our babies with us, and they would grab the basket with the baby. They would look inside. If it was a boy, they would throw it into the river. So this is not only ancient history. And here is a list of quotations about oppression and freedom. And you can simply ask people to read through these and pick one that speaks to you and explain why it speaks to you. And suddenly you have a very philosophic conversation without much preparation involved. Obviously, don't try to do all of these. Do one of them. That's more than enough. Or have your expert in politics give a report of what's the status of freedom and slavery, of poverty and prosperity in the world today. Here's the 10 plagues. And here, I won't give you time to do it here, but I recommend, these are 10 plagues, actually 9 plagues, because our artist forgot by mistake to bring one of the plagues. So here you can have people try to figure out which plague was skipped, as well as the people who can say, how is he reusing famous paintings? You know what painting this is from? The horse? Pablo Picasso's Guernica. This is from Edvard Munch's The Scream. And this is from, what's the name of the photographer of the Southwest? Can't remember right off the top of my head, but there's all kinds of ways to do that. Now, you have Dayenu. We talked about listing the things that you're thankful for this year. Here's the explanation of the Pesach, the Matzah, and the Maror. Very simple, very short. Then you have the songs, the Hallel, the Psalms. The best one to do is B'tzeit Yisrael mi Mitzrayim, because it's directly related to the Exodus from Egypt. And then you have your second cup, and you're done with the main part of the Seder, the most important part of the Seder. And now the food. So here's the eating of matzah and maror with all kinds of added ideas. Here is the charoset recipes, and there's many more that we sent you. Here's the meal with all the various family members. And then comes afikoman. Now, afikoman sort of completes for us the complete cycle, right? It's that matzah that disappeared is now coming back to us. And therefore, at this point, it's typical in families, as Maimonides suggested, for somebody to hide the matzah, for the children to find it, and then to hold us ransom until we pay off for giving us the matzah, because we have to finish the meal with that piece of matzah. So one of the suggestions we make is the following. It is recommended that Jewish prizes be offered for whoever brings the afikoman, or for all the children, as well as the promise of some money. Some families ask the children to give 10% of their afikoman prize to a tzedakah, to a charity of their choice, and to announce the beneficiary at this point. The adults may be solicited for matching gifts. So if you can get the kids to come together and to decide how to donate their 10% of the money, and then you give them 10 times as much that you add to it, then again, you're turning an event of receiving money into an empowerment to share your money with others. And perhaps you can pick a tzedakah, which is in some way related to issues and themes having to do with Passover. Here we have Leonard Cohen's poem, Broke 'Em Unto You. Here we have various rules for the afikoman game in different traditions. Here's the part simply thanking God at the end, the third cup. And now we have Elijah. Now, Elijah is all about telling us that the Messiah is coming. And all about bringing together, as we talked last time, the hearts of the parents, turning it to the children, the hearts of the children, turning it to the parents. And here is a Hasidic custom, which I love very much. Maybe I mentioned it last time, I don't remember. And that is when you have the big cup, instead of filling it up yourself, you have everybody at the table add a little bit of their wine from their cup into the big Elijah cup. And at the same time for them to say, these are my hopes for the next year. And these are some of the things I hope to do to help those hopes come true. His idea was that by filling up the cup, we are taking some sort of active role in bringing tikkun olam to the world. And now I'm going to the very end of the Haggadah, and then we'll open it up for questions. And this, of course, is one of the most important things. I'm skipping the songs, which you'll do whenever you feel like it. And we get to next year in Jerusalem. This is the part that we already had promised us at the beginning of the Haggadah, the expectation for the hope and for the future. So when you think about Jerusalem, you have to think about Jerusalem not only as the place where I happen to live, or the place which is the capital of Israel, and even the place where the U.S. Embassy finally is located, but as a symbol of Jewish political independence, as a symbol of the coming of the Messiah, as the symbol used in many, many different countries of a better world, right? And so here we have something you could imagine also for your American society, and that is, or Canadian, the idea is to imagine if every one of the things tearing your society apart were to come together in the future, what would it look like? So our artist decided to show all the fault lines in Israeli society and try to imagine that those fault lines would be bridged. So the first thing he did was he created a new gate to the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem has 8 gates, but he created a new gate called Shar HaShalom, the gate of peace, which is why he put in an olive tree and a dove, which are symbols of peace. The second thing is atop it, he put a caricature of Theodor Herzl, who wrote his utopian novel about what Israel would be like 50 years after the establishment of the state. And he has a beautiful image of Israel, a 7-hour work week, a social welfare society with equality for Arabs and Jews, etc., etc. But here he's frowning as he compares his utopia with what Israel really is. And all of us, of course, have the gap between our ideal image of America and our ideal image of Israel and what the reality is. And the elections, we have another one this week, are a good reflection of the brokenness and the gap between the dream and the reality. So here in this picture, he first of all put a picture of the Messiah. Since the Messiah is supposed to be a descendant of David, and David had red hair or ruddy complexion, he turns him into a kind of a hippie King David on his white donkey coming into Jerusalem. I often find that when even American Jews look at this picture, they say, why did the artist put Jesus in the Haggadah? And that's only because they don't know enough about the Old Testament, because the New Testament is based on an imitation of the Old Testament. Jesus goes looking for a donkey to come into Jerusalem because Isaiah said that the Messiah would come on a donkey. Jesus was born in Bethlehem because David is from Bethlehem. So this is really a very Jewish Messiah. And next to the Messiah is the image of Isaiah of the end of time, when the wolf and the lamb will lie down together. Unfortunately, our artist, who didn't have a good biblical background, he turned it into the wolf and the goat. He also had, of course, Israel is always torn apart between left and right, and Israel's football teams, their soccer teams, are also sponsored, one by the Labor Party, red, and one by the Likud Party, yellow. And they usually hate each other, but in this ideal picture, they're friends together, the two different political parties, the two different sportsmen. Or here you have an Arab nationalist wearing the keffiyeh, which is the symbol of the Palestine liberation along with an Israeli religious Zionist settler. And here they're having coffee together. And here their wives, both of them with their head coverings, are speaking together and comparing babies. In the background, you have the only Haggadah, I think, in the world that has a picture of the Dome of the Rock with a Muslim symbol, of a church with a cross, and with a Jewish building in the old city, which has a menorah on it. Because part of our vision is a coming of peace between the monotheistic religions and Jerusalem coming to meet that. Again, our artist wasn't so good with his Jewish background, and so he put in the mezuzah background backwards, leaning the wrong way, but I guess you could fix it on your own. And even the taxi cab driver is involved. He's sitting in a taxi that's called the End of Days Taxi. And he has a newspaper in which he's reading about his personal messianic period in which the Israeli soccer team, don't worry, this will never happen, the Israeli soccer team wins the World Cup Mondial. That for him would take quite a miracle. In the Haggadah, we have all kinds of things that are about hope. The song Next Year in Jerusalem, a beautiful, beautiful poem by Yitzhak Cook about one soul, the nation, humanity, and the cosmos. And here is a beautiful piece that I would read this year by Anna Frank, I Still Believe. That's the difficulty in these times. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us, only to meet the horrible truth and be shattered. It is really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals. And Anna Frank goes on how in 1944, when she's hiding in Amsterdam, not long before she's going to be informed upon and sent to concentration camp where she dies, she's talking about having hope. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out. This year, I would think that you could take a piece of the beautiful poem that Amanda Gorman read in honor of the inauguration, take a short section from that, maybe have somebody read it out loud using all the hand motions that Amanda Gorman has in order to celebrate our hope for the future. And here we even put in the Martin Luther Dream, I Have a Dream speech, and something from Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had invited Martin Luther King to come to his Seder but unfortunately he was assassinated just a short time before the Seder. So those are some of the ideas that I recommend to you. I'm going to stop sharing. Now I'll know what time it is. Oh, time's up. And if you have any questions, please ask your questions.
Thank you so much, Noam. Someone had a question about the Afikomen, and if you could suggest something for a Seder that does not have any children.
First of all, the Afikomen is not only for the children. And second of all, adults like to be children. And so if you have somebody hiding something, they'll like to find it. Just like when I show them the picture of the 10 plagues missing a plague, the adults, as much as the children, are desperate to find the answer as quickly as possible. But more largely, the Afikoman is about completing and fulfillment and finding long lost things and bringing them back together. And I think the poem by Leonard Cohen is a good one to read there and then to open up to people talking about things that are missing in their lives that they're hoping will be filled. That's at least one way to do it with the Afikoman.
Okay, any other questions? I feel like maybe there was one, but I can't seem to find it now. So if you have a question, please post it in the chat box or let us know that you want to ask a question. Everyone's saying thank you very much for all of these resources and this class. Someone wrote in that they have a hard time making the plagues kind of like fun or light with the children because they indicate suffering.
Right. Look, especially in the year of Corona, we have to take plagues seriously. In other years, perhaps we'll be able to repress the memory of Corona and then to go back to making fun with the plagues, of which there's many, many ways to do that. So I don't really have a solution. I would list what we think the plagues of the last year have been and have Corona ones. And of course, part of the plague tradition is to take a little bit of wine out of our cup for each one of those plagues, usually interpreted as a way of decreasing our joy, because we know that our liberation required a struggle, as all struggles, all liberation struggles require very often violence and certainly struggle. And I would say this year, we need to talk also about the plagues of systemic racism and and talk about those plagues. Those are also plagues that we need to get in touch with. And